She'd sent me a letter, an actual paper letter, handwritten, 2 months after she left the village. She said she'd inherited her grandmother's house in the mountains and stayed only 8 days. She said on the first night, someone knocked on the door, and that on the fourth night, she opened it. This story came from a school teacher from Seoul who inherited a house in a remote mountain village in Gangwon province. She asked me not to use her real name. I've called her Jisoo. Everything else, the candles in every window, the scratched out photograph in the wooden box, the child in the school uniform who stood at the end of the lane and had no face, is exactly as she described it to me. The road up to Mudeok was the kind that made a person check their phone twice. Jisoo had lost signal an hour ago, somewhere after the second mountain pass, and the GPS had simply given up, the screen showing a blue dot floating in empty grey space. No roads, no names, nothing. She drove anyway because there was nowhere to turn around. The trees pressed close on both sides. Their leaves had already turned deep amber and rust, and a few fell slowly across the windshield as she passed. The mist sat low between the trunks, not moving, just resting there like it belonged. It was early afternoon by her watch, but the light felt much later. Everything in this place seemed to be running on a different clock. Mudeok appeared without warning. One moment there were trees. Then there was a lane, 2 rows of low stone houses with dark tile roofs, a small store with a handwritten sign in the window, and an old wooden post with no sign on it at all. That was the whole village. Maybe 30 homes if she counted generously. Jisoo parked in front of the house her grandmother had left her. It was smaller than she remembered from her one childhood visit. The gate was wood, the paint long gone. A ceramic pot by the front step held dried stems from a plant that had given up before summer ended. She had never been close to her grandmother. They had spoken by phone, maybe 4 times a year, short calls that ended with her grandmother saying, "Study hard," even after Jisoo had finished university and started teaching. When the lawyer called to tell her about the will, Jisoo's first feeling was guilt. Her second was confusion. Why leave it to her? She had 2 aunts, an uncle, cousins who had visited regularly. But the house had been left to Jisoo, and no explanation was given. She brought in her bag and stood in the middle of the main room. The house smelled of dried wood and something faintly herbal, medicinal almost. The furniture was simple: a low table, a floor cushion, a single shelf of old books. On the wall, a small framed photograph of a mountain she didn't recognize. Nothing personal, no pictures of family, no sign that a woman had lived here for 40 years. By the time she had swept the floor and opened the windows, her neighbor came. The woman was old, 70s, maybe older. She moved slowly, but with purpose, carrying a tray with 2 cups of barley tea. Her name was Haesoon. She smiled and bowed slightly when Jisoo opened the gate. "You must be the granddaughter," Haesoon said. "Yes." "Jisoo, you came alone." It wasn't a question. Jisoo nodded. They sat together at the low table. Haesoon asked about the drive, about Seoul, about whether Jisoo planned to sell the house. Jisoo answered honestly. She hadn't decided. Haesoon nodded at each answer, but her eyes were elsewhere, moving over the corners of the room, the windows, the door. The tea in Jisoo's cup had gone cool. Haesoon had not touched hers at all. When she left, she paused at the gate. "Sleep well," she said. Then, quieter, "Keep the door closed at night. The wind comes down from the mountain." Jisoo said she would. She watched Hesoon walk back to her house across the lane, step inside, and shut the door firmly behind her. Dinner was simple: rice and canned fish she had brought from the city. She ate by the window and watched the lane go dark. There were no streetlights. One by one, the lights in the other houses went off until the village was almost entirely black. A few homes had small candles in their windows, unlit, just placed there on the sill. She noticed them without thinking much of it. She fell asleep quickly. The quiet of the mountain was different from the quiet of the city, deeper, without hum or traffic, without the feeling that noise was just being paused somewhere nearby. This silence felt like it had been here long before any houses, and would stay long after. The knocking came at 2 in the morning. 3 slow sounds, measured, patient, not loud, the kind of knock a child makes when they're not sure they're allowed to ask. Jisoo sat up in the dark. She waited, listening. The silence pressed back. She told herself it was the wind, or a branch, or the old wood of the house settling in the cold. She lay back down. 3 more knocks. Same pace, same weight. She got up. The main room was dark, except for the pale light coming through the window from the sky outside. She crossed to the front door and opened it without thinking, the way you do when you're still half asleep and your body moves before your mind can stop it. The lane was empty. No wind, no movement in the trees at the end of the road. The mist had come back and sat in low drifts along the ground, the way it had when she arrived. The cold touched her face and arms immediately. She looked down. The gravel in front of the step held 2 small impressions. Bare feet, side by side, child-sized. They faced away from the door, pointing toward the center of the lane, as if someone had stood there, then walked away. But there were no other prints. Nothing leading to the door. Nothing leading anywhere further. Just those 2 shapes, shallow and clear, already softening at the edges in the damp air. Jisoo stood very still. Across the lane, a light was on in Hesoon's front window. The old woman was standing there, a shape behind the thin curtain, watching. Jisoo raised her hand slowly to wave. The curtain closed. The light went off. Jisoo stayed in the doorway for a long moment, looking at the empty lane, at the place where the mist moved around the footprints without filling them in. She stepped back inside. She closed the door. She did not lock it because she had not yet decided if locking it would make her feel safer or simply more aware of what was on the other side. She did not sleep again that night. In the morning, she boiled water for instant coffee and stood at the front window. The lane was ordinary in daylight: gravel, stone walls, tile roofs catching the pale October sun. She looked for the footprints, but the ground had been disturbed, softened overnight by moisture. There was nothing to see. She went out to buy bread from the small store. The man behind the counter smiled and did not ask her name, though he clearly knew who she was. 2 older women outside nodded at her. A child on a bicycle slowed down to look, then pedaled away quickly. No one mentioned the night. No one asked if she had heard anything. She thought about bringing it up. The knocking, the prints. But each time she opened her mouth, the words felt out of place, like asking a question in a room where the answer had already been given a long time ago, and everyone else had simply accepted it. She went back to the house and stood in the middle of the main room again, the same way she had the day before. This time, it felt different, smaller. She looked at the walls, the shelf, the photograph of the mountain. She looked at the door. Her grandmother had lived here for 40 years, had heard the same knock, had kept the same silence. The question wasn't what had been at the door. The question was why no one here thought it needed explaining. She noticed the candles on the second evening. Not because they were lit. They weren't. Each one sat in a window unlit, a plain white stub in a plain ceramic holder, placed at the center of the sill, like something left out for inspection. Some were new. Some had melted halfway down and hardened again into waxy shapes that leaned slightly to one side. All of them faced outward, toward the lane. Jisoo counted them as she walked back from the store. Every house had one, every window that faced the lane. She had not noticed them on her first evening because she had not known to look. Now that she saw them, she could not stop. She asked the man at the store. His name was Mr. Cho. She had learned that much. He was somewhere in his 60s, quiet and efficient, the kind of man who gave you exactly what you asked for and nothing more. The candles in the windows, she said. Is it for a holiday? He looked at her for a moment. Then he put her change on the counter instead of handing it to her. Old custom, he said. Mountain villages have them. What does it mean? He began straightening a stack of newspapers that did not need straightening. It means people remember where they come from. She waited, in case he wanted to say more. He did not. Outside, she stood for a moment in the thin afternoon light. A woman passed with a bag of groceries and nodded without meeting her eyes. Two men sat on a stone wall further up the lane, talking quietly, and went silent as she walked by. She had grown used to this already. The way conversation paused slightly whenever she was near, then resumed once she was past. It was not hostile. It was something else. Careful, maybe. Like people choosing words in a language they weren't sure she spoke. She had been in Mudeok for 3 days. She still had not decided about the house. There were papers to sign, small things to sort through. A visit scheduled with a local official next week. She told herself she was staying for practical reasons. But the truth was simpler and harder to say. She wanted to understand what she had heard on the first night and why no one would talk about it. The boy found her on the 4th morning. She was sitting outside on the front step with her coffee, watching the lane, when she noticed him. He was maybe 10 years old, small for his age, wearing a school jacket that was slightly too big. He stood at the corner of the lane with his bicycle, not riding it, just holding the handlebars, watching her the way children watch things they have been told not to touch. She lifted her cup toward him in a small greeting. He didn't move for a moment. Then he walked the bicycle slowly closer and stopped a few feet from her gate. "You're the grandmother's granddaughter," he said. "I am. Jisoo. I'm Wusung." He looked at the house, then at her. "Are you going to stay?" "I don't know yet." He nodded, as if this was the answer he had expected. He scuffed one shoe against the gravel. She could see him working up to something. The way a child looks when they are carrying information they're not sure they're supposed to share. "Did you hear it?" he asked. "The knocking." She set her cup down carefully. "Yes." He looked up and down the lane. No one else was outside. He leaned the bicycle against the wall and crouched down, his elbows on his knees, his voice dropping, even though there was no one near enough to hear. "The adults won't talk about it," he said. "They say it's nothing. They say if you don't think about it, it doesn't come. But you don't believe that. I've heard it every October since I was little." He picked up a small piece of gravel and turned it in his fingers. My grandmother told me once, before she stopped talking about it too. Jisoo waited. A long time ago, he said, there was a girl who lived here. She went missing one night in autumn. They said she got lost on the mountain. He paused, but she didn't get lost. What happened to her? He was quiet for a moment. She comes back every year. When the first frost comes, she knocks on every door. He looked at Jisoo directly for the first time. She doesn't have a face. The lane was perfectly still. A single leaf came down from the tree at the corner, slow and turning. My grandmother said that if you open the door and really look, all the way, not just a crack, you forget something by morning, something important. He stood up and took his bicycle again. I don't know if it's true. Has it happened to anyone you know? He looked at her for a long moment. Your grandmother never forgot anything, he said. She never opened the door, not once. Not in all the years she was here. He got on his bicycle and rode away before she could ask anything else. She watched him go until he turned the corner and disappeared. She sat back down on the step. The coffee had gone cold. She held the cup anyway, needing something to hold. A girl. No face. Every door. Every autumn. And something taken from those who looked. She told herself it was folklore. Every old village had stories like this. Cautionary things, passed from grandparents to children over generations, until the original meaning had worn smooth, and only the fear remained. She was a school teacher. She knew how stories worked. She knew that people built myths around the things they couldn't explain or didn't want to. She almost believed herself. That night, she made sure the door was locked. She read for a while. A novel she had brought from the city. Its world so far from this one that the sentences barely registered. She turned off the light at 11 and lay in the dark and listened to the mountain quiet. At 1:30, the knocking came. 3 slow sounds, the same as before. She did not move. She lay with her eyes open, staring at the ceiling. Her heart was steady, not racing. She noticed this, how calm she felt, which frightened her more than panic would have. She counted her breaths. She told herself, do not open the door. She thought about Wusong. She thought about his grandmother telling him, once, before she stopped talking about it. She thought about her own grandmother, all those years in this house, all those October nights, never opening the door, not once. She got up. She did not know why. Or she did know. There was something in the patience of those 3 knocks, the same weight and pace as the night before, that made not answering feel worse than answering, as if ignoring it were its own kind of cruelty. She crossed the room. She put her hand on the door. She opened it all the way, not a crack, not halfway, all the way, so that the night air came fully in and the lane was fully visible, empty as before. The mist, the gravel, the dark tile roofs against the pale sky. She stood there for a full minute. Nothing. She almost laughed at herself. She closed the door and went back to bed. In the morning, she stood at the kitchen window and watched the lane while the water boiled. She thought about her mother, about calling her, about asking if she had ever visited Mudeok, about whether grandmother had ever said anything about the village. She reached for her phone. She stood there for a long time. She could not remember her mother's voice, not the sound of it, not the specific quality that made it hers. The small rise at the end of sentences, the way she said Jisoo's name when she was worried. She knew the facts. Her mother existed. They spoke regularly. They loved each other. But the sound, the actual living sound, was gone. Like a word you have said so many times, it stops meaning anything. She pressed call. The phone rang 4 times and went to voicemail. Her mother's recorded voice said, "You've reached Kim Mi-yeon. Please leave a message." Jisoo listened to it twice, then a 3rd time. She was trying to remember if that was what her mother had always sounded like, or if something had changed in the night while she slept with the door open and the mist coming in off the mountain lane. She could not tell. That was the worst part. She could not tell. She started with the practical things. That was how she managed it, treating the house like a task rather than a place, moving from room to room with a notepad, cataloging what was there, the furniture, the kitchen items, the books on the shelf. She was a teacher. She was good at making order out of things that did not want to be ordered. The main room took half a morning. The kitchen was quick. The small storage room off the hallway took longer because it was full of boxes that had been packed and repacked over many years, layers of her grandmother's life compressed into cardboard and old newspaper, dishes wrapped in cloth, a broken clock, envelopes of old photographs, none of them labeled, most of them showing people Jisoo did not recognize, standing in front of mountains or markets or ordinary doorways. She set those aside to look at later. The wooden box was at the back of the lowest shelf, pushed against the wall and half covered by an old blanket. It was not large, about the size of a shoebox, but heavier, made from dark lacquered wood with a small brass latch. No lock, just the latch, pressed shut. She almost left it for another day. She was tired, and the light in the storage room was poor, and there was still the kitchen shelf to finish, but her hand was already on it, and the weight of it was specific. Not the weight of something empty, but something deliberately kept. She carried it to the low table in the main room and sat down in front of it. She opened it. Inside, resting on a folded piece of faded silk, were 2 things. The first was a photograph, small, black and white. The corners soft with age. It showed a young girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, standing in front of what looked like the lane outside. She wore a school uniform. Her posture was straight. Her hands were at her sides, and where her face should have been, the photograph had been scratched. Not torn or burned, but scratched, carefully and completely, in tight circles, until the surface of the paper was nearly worn through. Only the face. Everything else was intact. Jisoo held the photograph and said nothing for a long time. The second object was an envelope, thick, cream-colored, sealed with a strip of tape that had gone brittle and yellow. On the front, in her grandmother's handwriting, small and precise, the same handwriting Jisoo recognized from birthday cards received years ago, were 2 lines. To the Village Council of Mudeok. Winter, 1993. Not sent. She opened it carefully, peeling the tape back without tearing the paper. Inside was a single sheet, folded in thirds. The handwriting was the same, but pressed harder, as if the pen had been gripped tightly. Jisoo read it once, then went back to the beginning and read it again, more slowly. It was not a long letter. Her grandmother had never been a woman who used more words than necessary. But each sentence sat on the page with the weight of something that had been rewritten many times before it was finally committed to ink. The letter described a night in November 1993, a village meeting Jisoo's grandmother had attended, a discussion about a girl named Somi, a child who had been causing what the letter called disruption. The word was written plainly, without quotation marks, which made it worse. Disruption, as if a child's existence could be filed under a practical complaint. The letter said that a decision had been made at that meeting. That Somi, who had no father, whose mother had left the village 2 years prior, who had been living with an elderly aunt who was herself unwell, would be asked to leave. Relocated was the word the council had used. There was a facility in the next province. Someone had made arrangements. It was decided quickly and without much argument, because the people in that room had already decided before they arrived, and the meeting was only the formality of saying it out loud. Jisoo's grandmother had been in that room. She had not spoken against it. The letter continued. It said that Somi had been told to leave on a Thursday evening in late November, that it was cold that night, the first frost of the season, that the aunt was not well enough to accompany her, that someone was supposed to drive the child to the next town, where she would be collected, that the person who was supposed to drive did not come. Somi had walked. She had not arrived. They found her on the mountain path 4 days later. The letter did not describe what they found. It did not need to. The space where those details would have been was left blank. A full line of white paper, which Jisoo understood was its own kind of description. The village had buried Somi on the mountain. No announcement, no ceremony open to outsiders. And then, quietly, over the following years, they had done something more complete. They had turned her into a story, a ghost, a thing that knocked on doors in autumn, faceless and frightening, something to be managed with candles and closed doors and half-spoken warnings to children. It was easier to fear her, the letter said, than to grieve her, easier to make her into something inhuman than to remember that she had been a child in a school uniform who stood with her hands at her sides and waited to be told what would happen to her next. The letter ended with one sentence. I have kept this silence for 30 years, and I do not know if that makes me the same as the rest of them or something worse. Because I knew, and I said nothing, and I stayed. Jisoo set the letter down on the table. She sat with it for a long time. Outside, the lane was quiet. The October light came through the window at a low angle and lay across the floor in a pale rectangle that moved slowly as the afternoon passed. She thought about her grandmother, the woman who had sent birthday cards with small, precise handwriting, the woman who ended every phone call with study hard, the woman who had lived in this house for 40 years, in this village, among these people, with this knowledge folded up in a wooden box at the back of a shelf. She thought about Somi, 7, maybe 8 years old, standing on a mountain path in November cold, waiting for a car that was not coming. She picked up the letter. She carried it to the kitchen. She turned on the gas burner and held the corner of the paper over the flame. It caught quickly. She held it over the sink and watched it burn, the handwriting curling and darkening, the words her grandmother had never sent going to ash in her fingers. She told herself she didn't know why she was doing it, but she did know. She was doing it because the letter named people, because it named her grandmother, because once a thing like that is known, you are responsible for what you do with it. And she was not ready for that responsibility yet. The last corner dropped into the sink and went black. She turned off the burner. She ran the cold water and washed the ash down the drain. Then she stood very still, because she had just done exactly what the village had done. She had taken a truth and made it disappear because it was inconvenient to hold. The candle on the windowsill lit itself. She turned slowly, the small white stub in its ceramic holder, the one she had placed there without thinking on her second evening. Because every house had one, because it was custom, because she had not asked enough questions, was burning. A low, steady flame, barely moving, throwing almost no light at all. She had not lit it. She had no matches out. The gas burner was across the room. She stared at it for a long time. Then she pulled a chair to the table and sat down in front of the wooden box. The photograph still inside it. The scratched-out face still pointing up at the ceiling. She did not close the lid. She did not move the candle. She sat there as the afternoon became evening, and the light in the lane went grey and then dark, and she let herself understand, for the first time since arriving in Mudeok, that whatever was knocking on these doors at night was not something to be afraid of. It was something that deserved to be answered. She woke before dawn to the sound of her own breathing. That was the first thing she noticed. How loud it was in the silence. How the air in the room felt different, thinner, colder. She lay still for a moment and stared at the ceiling, and then she understood. The temperature had dropped in the night, significantly, the kind of drop that happens in a single hour when a season decides it has been patient long enough. She got up and went to the window. Frost, a clean white layer of it across the gravel lane. The tile roofs, the top of the stone walls, the dried stems of the pot by her front step. The mountain above the village was lost in low cloud. The sky was not yet light, but it was no longer fully dark. That particular grey hour before dawn, when everything is visible, but nothing has color yet. She stood at the window for a long time. Then she looked at the lane more carefully. Every door in Mudeok was shut. She had not noticed until now how ordinary that seemed during the day. People going in and out, gates opening, children leaving for school. But this was different. These doors were shut. The way doors are shut when people are not simply inside, but when they are deliberately, consciously not outside. Every window that faced the lane had its curtain drawn. Every house was dark except for one thing: the candles. All of them burning now, lit sometime in the night, throwing small steady flames that pressed against the glass from inside. The village had closed itself. She knew what night this was. The first frost. The night Wusong had described. The night the letter had named without naming. A Thursday in late November. The first frost of the season. A child on a mountain path. She stood at the window and understood that every person in every one of those dark, shut houses was awake, sitting with their lights off and their doors bolted and their candles burning, waiting for it to pass, doing what they had done every October for 30 years, because it was easier than doing anything else. She put on her coat. She was not sure when she decided. It did not feel like a decision so much as the end of a process that had begun the morning she found the box. Or perhaps earlier, the moment she opened the door all the way on the second night, driven by something she had called foolishness and now understood was closer to instinct. Some part of her had been moving toward this all week. The rest of her had simply been slow to catch up. She unlocked the front door and stepped outside. The cold was immediate and total. It pressed against her face and hands, and found the gaps at her collar and wrists. The frost crunched faintly under her shoes. Her breath came out in white clouds that rose and vanished. The lane stretched away from her in both directions, completely empty, perfectly still, the candle flames in every window burning without motion behind their glass. No wind, no sound from the mountain, no dogs, no birds, nothing. She walked to the center of the lane and stopped. She looked toward the far end of the village, where the lane narrowed and the last few houses gave way to the mountain path. And there, at the very edge of where the lane ended and the dark began, was a figure, small, still, standing exactly where the gravel met the dirt of the path. A child, or the shape of one, a school uniform, dark with age, the collar and cuffs faintly visible in the gray pre-dawn light. Arms at the sides, feet together, the posture of a child who has been taught to stand correctly and has not forgotten, even now, even after everything. Where the face should have been, there was nothing. Not darkness, not shadow, nothing. A smooth, pale blankness, like a page that had been carefully, completely erased. Jisoo did not run. She did not step back. She stood in the frost and looked, and the figure stood at the end of the lane and was still. A long moment passed, the kind that has no real measure. Then Jisoo took one step forward, then another. Slow, the way you move towards something you do not want to startle. The frost crunched under each step. She kept her eyes on the figure, and the figure did not move, did not turn, did not retreat, did not do anything except remain. Present, patient, the same patience she had heard in those 3 slow knocks, night after night. She stopped when she was close enough to see clearly. The blankness where the face should have been was not like a mask or a wound. It was more like a held breath, as if something was just underneath, pressing gently from the other side, waiting to be allowed through. The school uniform was the kind from another era, the collar cut square, the buttons small and dark. The hands at the sides were a child's hands, small-knuckled, still. Jisoo did not look away. Most people did, she understood now. They opened the door a crack. They saw enough to frighten them. They closed it, or they opened it fully, as she had on the second night. But they looked, and then flinched back, broke the gaze, stepped away. And so they lost something by morning. A sound, a face, a name, some fragment of the people they loved. Because they had looked, and then retreated, and retreat has its own cost. She did not look away, and slowly, the way frost melts, not all at once, but in a slow, quiet release, the blankness began to change. It did not become a face in the way a face appears in a dream, fully formed and sudden. It was more gradual than that, a suggestion of a brow, the curve of a cheek, the line where a jaw met a neck, features assembling themselves not from nothing, but from something that had always been there, waiting for someone to stay long enough to see them. And then, for just a moment, clear and complete, there was a face, a child's face, 7, maybe 8 years old. Eyes that were not frightening, eyes that were something far simpler and harder to bear than frightening. She was waiting to be seen. That was all. That was the whole of it. Not vengeance, not hunger, not the particular cruelty that ghost stories usually required. Just a child who had been erased from the photograph, from the village records, from 30 years of careful, collective forgetting, standing in the frost at the end of the lane with her hands at her sides, knocking on every door, because knocking on doors was the only way she knew to say, I was here. I was real. Someone should know that. Jisoo felt something move through her chest that was not fear. It was older than fear and heavier. It was the feeling of understanding something you cannot unfeel once you have felt it, something that will ask something of you from this point forward, whether you choose to answer or not. She opened her mouth. Her voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. Somi. The name sat in the cold air between them. The figure was still, but something in the stillness changed. The way a room changes when a window is opened, not in any visible way, but in the quality of the air, the sense that something that had been closed is now just slightly less so. Then the gray hour ended. The sky began, almost imperceptibly, to lighten. The first pale color of dawn touched the mountain cloud above the village, and the figure at the end of the lane was gone. Not dramatically. No sound, no motion, no final image to hold. One moment she was there. The next moment the lane ended at the mountain path, and the path was empty, and the frost lay undisturbed across everything, as if nothing had stood on it at all. Jisoo stood alone in the cold for a long time. She looked at the houses on both sides of the lane. The candles in the windows were still burning. Behind every curtain, every shut door, 30 years of practiced silence sat and waited for morning to make it acceptable again. She looked at her own front door, standing open behind her, the dark of the house visible inside. She had stepped outside. She had looked. She had stayed. She had said the name. It was not enough. She knew that. One name spoken once in the dark by a woman who had only been here a week, who had burned the letter, who had almost driven back to Seoul on the third day. It was not enough to balance 30 years. It was not enough to give back what had been taken, which was not a face or a ghost story's resolution, but something more plain and permanent. A child's right to have existed in the memory of the people who had known her. But it was a beginning. It was, at least, a beginning. She went inside only long enough to find a marker and a bag of the small stones she had noticed in the storage room. River stones, smooth and flat. The kind people keep without knowing exactly why. There were perhaps 40 of them in an old clay pot, left by her grandmother, like so many other things in this house, without explanation, without instruction, as if their purpose would eventually make itself clear. It had. She sat at the low table and wrote the same thing on each stone. 2 characters, a name, Somi. She wrote it in plain, steady strokes, the way she wrote on a whiteboard for her students, clearly, without flourish, so that it could be read from a distance. She wrote it 30 times, 1 for every year. The marker dried quickly in the cold air, coming through the gap under the door, and she had to press harder toward the end. But she did not stop until every stone was done, and the bag was full, and the marker was empty. Then she went back out into the morning. The frost was still hard on the ground. The sky had lightened to a pale, even gray, the kind of light that comes before the sun clears the mountain, clean and shadowless and honest. The candles in the village windows had burned low through the night. A few had gone out. The ones still burning threw almost no light against the growing dawn, their flames reduced to small, trembling points that would last another hour at most. She started at the far end of the lane, the end nearest the mountain path, where Somi had stood. She placed the first stone at the base of the gatepost of the last house on the left. She set it flat side up, so the name was visible, facing the lane. She did not knock. She did not need to. She was not there to ask anything of these people. She was there to leave something behind. She moved to the next house. then the next. The village was still completely quiet. No doors opened, no curtains moved. The frost crunched softly under each step, and her breath came out white, and the stones clicked lightly together in the bag as she walked. She worked slowly, placing each one carefully, not throwing them down, not leaving them carelessly, but setting them with the deliberateness of someone who understands that small gestures done with full attention are not small at all. She was halfway down the lane when Hesun's door opened. Jisoo stopped. She turned. The old woman stood in her doorway in a heavy cardigan, her white hair loose around her face in a way Jisoo had not seen before. She had always worn it pinned back, neat and controlled. Now it hung to her shoulders, and she looked both older and somehow more herself. She looked at Jisoo. She looked at the bag of stones. She looked at the one Jisoo had just placed at her own gatepost, the name facing upward in black ink. Something crossed Hasun's face that Jisoo could not fully name. Not surprise. It was past surprise. Whatever it was, something that had been held for a very long time and had finally, in the presence of a witness, been allowed to move. The old woman's eyes filled. She did not speak. She pressed one hand to her mouth and stood in her doorway and wept without sound, her shoulders pulling inward, her whole body folding slightly around whatever she was feeling, the way a person folds around a wound when they finally stop pretending it doesn't hurt. Jisoo did not go to her. She understood, without having to think about it, that Hasun did not need comfort right now. She needed to be allowed to do this. She needed someone to see her doing it and not look away. So Jisoo stood in the frost and watched, and Hasun stood in her doorway and wept, and neither of them said anything, and that was the right thing. After a while, Hasun lowered her hand. She wiped her face with the back of her wrist. She looked at Jisoo for a long moment with red-rimmed eyes. "She used to come to my door," Hasun said quietly, "when she was alive. Not at night, in the daytime. She liked the sweets I kept in a jar by the window." She stopped. She looked at the stone at her gatepost. "I voted with the others at the meeting." She said it plainly, without trying to soften it. "I have thought about that every day since." Jisoo held the bag of stones and said nothing. There was nothing to say that would help, and she knew that, and she did not try. "Your grandmother wrote a letter," Hasun said. It was not a question. "Yes." "Did you read it?" "Yes." Hasun nodded slowly. "She wrote it every few years, different versions. She never sent any of them." She looked at Jisoo. She was a woman who knew she had done wrong and could not find the way to make it right. And so she stayed. She stayed here her whole life because she thought leaving would be worse than staying. I don't know if she was right. Jisoo thought about that. About a woman who had spent 40 years in a village with a secret she had helped to keep, placing a letter in a wooden box and never sending it, ending every phone call with "study hard," as if the best thing she could offer the next generation was the discipline she herself had lacked when it mattered. "I burned the letter," Jisoo said. Hasun was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said. "I saw the smoke." She looked at the bag in Jisoo's hand. "But you came back out." Jisoo held her gaze. Then she reached into the bag and took out one more stone and held it out across the gate. Hasun looked at it. Then she reached out with both hands and took it, carefully, the way you accept something that has been a long time coming. She held it against her chest and went back inside, without another word. The door closed quietly behind her. Jisoo turned and continued down the lane. She passed Woo Sung's house, near the middle of the village. He was standing at his front window, still in his pajamas, watching her. When she looked up, he did not duck away. He raised one hand in a small wave, not a child's enthusiastic wave, but the careful wave of someone who understands the gravity of what they are witnessing and wants to be counted among those who saw it. She raised her hand back. She placed a stone at his gate and kept walking. Mr. Cho's store was at the near end of the lane. His window was dark, the sign unturned. But as she set a stone at his step, she heard movement behind the door, the shuffle of feet, the sound of a chair scraping back. He did not open the door. She had not expected him to. She placed the stone and moved on. She reached the last house, one stone left in the bag. She walked back to her grandmother's house, her house now, she supposed, though she still had not decided what that meant, and placed the final stone at her own gatepost. She pressed her thumb against the name for a moment, feeling the slight ridge the marker had left on the smooth surface. Then she stood at the end of the lane and looked toward the mountain path. In the frost, beginning at the point where the gravel ended and the dirt path began, there were footprints, child-sized, facing away from the village, heading up the mountain path, spaced evenly as a walking child's steps would be. They continued until the path curved out of sight behind the first stand of trees. They did not come back. Jisoo looked at them for a long time. She thought about following them. She decided against it. Some things were not meant to be followed, only acknowledged, only witnessed from where you stood and allowed to be what they were. She went inside. She put the kettle on. She sat at the low table, where the wooden box still sat open, the photograph still inside it, the small girl in the school uniform, the scratched-out face. She picked it up and looked at it carefully, the way she had not let herself look at it when she first found it. The face was gone. The paper was worn thin where the scratching had been thorough and deliberate. But the rest of the photograph was intact. The lane outside, the stone wall behind, the girl's school uniform, her straight posture, her hands at her sides, her shoes slightly scuffed at the toes, the shadow she cast on the ground beside her, small and ordinary and real. She was in the shadow. Even if the face was gone, she was in the shadow. She had stood in this lane, and the sun had been at a certain angle, and the world had recorded it. Jisoo set the photograph face up on the table. She drank her coffee. She watched the window. Outside, the mist that had sat over Mudeok since the morning she arrived was moving. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the slow, unconvinced way of something that has decided its work here is done. It thinned along the rooftops first, then along the lane, then along the wall of the mountain above, where the trees were bright with October color, amber and rust, and the particular deep red that only comes once a year and lasts about a week before it is gone. By the time she finished her coffee, the lane was in pale winter sunlight for the first time since she had arrived. She sat with it for a while. Then she reached for her phone and pressed call. It rang twice. Her mother picked up. "Jisoo," her mother said. There it was, the small rise at the end. The exact weight of that name in that voice, familiar and specific and hers. Jisoo closed her eyes. "Hi, Yoma," she said. "I just wanted to hear your voice." A pause. Then, warm and slightly confused in the way of a mother whose child has called for no practical reason. "Is everything all right?" Jisoo looked at the photograph on the table, at the stones outside through the window, one at every gatepost down the lane, at the mountain above the village, visible now, solid and indifferent and old. Yes, she said. I think so. I'll explain when I get home. She stayed on the phone for a long time after that, saying nothing important, just talking. The way you talk, when the talking itself is the point, when the voice on the other end is the thing you needed, and you are not ready yet to let the silence back in. On the windowsill, the candle, the one that had lit itself 3 nights ago, had burned all the way down in the night. The flame was gone. The wax had pooled and hardened around the base of the holder in a small white ring. It had lasted exactly as long as it needed to. Then it went out, and the window was just a window again, looking out onto a lane in the ordinary morning light. If this story stayed with you, I think it was meant to. New stories from across Asia, every week, right here. I'm Haunted East. Subscribe if you want to keep listening.